somewhere in your house right now, something is staring out a window at nothing in particular. Maybe it's a cat. Maybe it's a dog, sprawled in a patch of sun like it just won something. And here's a question you've probably never asked out loud because it sounds a little unhinged. Does it know it's there? Not in the sense of biology. Obviously, the heart is pumping. Obviously, the lungs are doing their thing. Nobody is arguing about plumbing. The real question sits somewhere else entirely. Is there a light on inside? A felt sense of being someone rather than just behaving like someone? This sounds like a small question. It is not a small question. It might be one of the strangest, thorniest puzzles science has ever tried to touch. And here's why it matters more than it seems. You already act like the answer is yes. You talk to your plants. You apologize to your car when it doesn't start. You have absolutely, at some point, said sorry to a table after walking into it. Humans are wired to assume there's a someone behind everything that moves. But assuming isn't the same as knowing, and that gap between the two is where this entire investigation lives. Let's set the emotional part aside for 1 second and get technical, because you'll need this term for the rest of the video. Philosophers have a word for the felt quality of experience. Qualia. It's not the wavelength of red light hitting your eye. It's the redness itself, the private, inner what it's like of seeing it. You have qualia when you're cold. You have qualia when you smell rain on hot pavement and feel 11 years old again for half a second. The question is whether a fish has anything remotely like that, or whether it's just circuitry responding to inputs with nothing behind the curtain at all. And here's the trap you fall into almost immediately. You cannot check, not directly, not even with other humans. You assume your best friend has an inner world because they look like you, talk like you, wince like you when they stub a toe. That assumption gets shakier the further a creature drifts from human shape. A chimpanzee still has a face you can read. An octopus does not. Neither does a bee. So science, for a very long time, took the easy way out and simply declared the answer was no for anything that wasn't us. That position has a name and a very specific origin point. A 17th century philosopher named Descartes proposed that animals were essentially elaborate clockwork. No inner life, no suffering, just mechanism dressed up as behavior. A shriek was just a hinge creaking. A struggle was just gears turning. It was tidy, convenient, and it turns out catastrophically wrong. But it stuck around in laboratories and textbooks for centuries, shaping the language scientists were even allowed to use. You didn't say an animal felt pain. You said it exhibited an aversive response. Emotion was treated as an embarrassing thing to imply, almost unscientific to say out loud. That began to crack open in the 20th century. Slowly and not without a fight. And it started, strangely enough, with a mirror. In 1970, a psychologist named Gordon Gallup Jr. ran an experiment so simple it almost sounds like a prank. He gave chimpanzees a mirror. Most animals treat their reflection as an intruder. Dogs bark at it. Birds attack the glass, convinced there's a rival on the other side that needs dealing with immediately. But after a few days, the chimps did something odd. They stopped treating the mirror as a stranger and started using it as a tool, checking their own teeth, twisting to look at parts of their body they'd never seen before. Then Gallup upped the stakes. While the chimps were sedated, he painted a small, odorless mark on their foreheads. When they woke and caught their reflection, they didn't paw at the glass. They reached up and touched their own actual faces. That single gesture became one of the most cited moments in animal cognition research, because to touch your own forehead in response to a reflection, you need some working concept of that is me. And if you have a concept of me, you have at least the scaffolding for self-awareness. The list of animals that pass this test is stranger than you'd guess. Great apes, yes. Dolphins, yes. Elephants, yes. And then, almost as a plot twist, magpies. A bird with a brain the size of a walnut, reaching up to touch its own feathers because it recognized the shape in the glass as itself. Dogs mostly fail, but that likely says more about the test than the dog. Dogs live through smell first and sight second. So testing their self-awareness with a mirror is a little like judging someone's intelligence using a test in a language they've never spoken. But recognizing yourself in a mirror and actually pondering your own existence are two very different mountains. And this is where things get genuinely strange, so stay with it for a moment. In 1974, a philosopher named Thomas Nagel wrote an essay asking what it's like to be a bat. Not how a bat's sonar works mechanically, what it feels like from the inside to build a picture of the world entirely out of echoes. His argument was unsettling in its simplicity. You could map every neuron, every signal, every twitch of a bat's brain in perfect detail, and you would still never know the private experience of navigating a cave by sound. The facts and the feeling are two separate things, and one doesn't hand you the other. Push that same question toward almost any creature, and it gets vertiginous fast. An octopus has roughly 3/5 of its neurons scattered through its arms rather than centralized in its head, meaning each arm may be quietly making its own decisions in parallel. What does it feel like to think in 8 directions at once? A bee reads the sky like a compass, sensing the polarization of sunlight in a way no human sense organ can replicate. What does that feel like? Nobody actually knows. Science can chart the machinery. It cannot open the door and step inside the room. Elephants make this question almost impossible to dodge. When a member of a herd dies, the others don't simply move on. They gather. They touch the body with their trunks, sometimes for hours, sometimes returning to that exact spot months later, long after the bones are gone, and linger there as if checking on something. Nobody can peer inside an elephant's mind and confirm what's happening, but elephants carry unusually large, emotionally wired brains. They remember individuals across years of separation, and they display behavior that looks from every measurable angle like grief. And grief requires something important, an understanding that a thing which existed no longer does. That distinction between alive and gone is not a small cognitive leap. Now swing to the opposite end of the spectrum, because the pattern doesn't stop at elephants. For decades, fish were written off entirely. A flinch wasn't pain, just reflex, nothing worth worrying about, which conveniently suited an entire industry built around not worrying about it. Then the research caught up. Fish carry nociceptors, the same class of pain-detecting neurons mammals rely on. They possess opioid receptors and respond to painkillers the way a mammal would. Some species, including a small reef fish called the cleaner wrasse, have even shown behavior in mirror tests that look suspiciously like self-recognition, enough that researchers are still arguing about what it means. Arguing is not nothing. A few decades ago, nobody thought there was anything worth arguing about. Insects push the question somewhere even stranger. Bees, when deliberately stressed, start behaving like pessimists. Offer them an ambiguous signal, something that might mean food or might mean nothing, and stressed bees stop bothering to check. That's not a quirky footnote. In mammals, that exact pattern is used as a marker of negative emotional states. And on the flip side, young bumblebees given tiny wooden balls will roll them around with no food reward attached, repeatedly, for no obvious reason other than what looks a lot like enjoyment. An insect playing. The evidence for inner experience keeps showing up in places you wouldn't think to look. Cuttlefish, when tested with a version of the classic delayed gratification setup where children are told they can have 1 marshmallow now or 2 if they wait, chose to hold out for better food later, provided the payoff was worth it. The same trade-off a 4-year-old wrestles with. Rats, when they take a wrong turn in a foraging task and miss out on a better reward, show a distinct neural signature in the brain afterward, along with a hesitant look back at the option they skipped, a pattern researchers have described as looking remarkably like regret. And scrub jays cache food for later, but here's the unsettling part. If they sense another bird watch them hide it, they'll wait until alone and quietly move the stash somewhere else. That requires imagining a future hunger and imagining what another mind might know. 2 separate acts of mental time travel performed by a bird. In 2012, a group of prominent neuroscientists put their names to something called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. Their conclusion wasn't hedged or cautious. The neural architecture required for conscious experience, they stated, is not unique to humans. It shows up across mammals, across birds, and even in some invertebrates like octopuses. Not possibly, not if we squint. The hardware for consciousness, present and accounted for, in a huge swath of the animal kingdom. None of this means a fish experiences the world the way a chimpanzee does, or that a dog's inner life mirrors a dolphin's. Consciousness looks less like a light switch, on or off, and more like a dial, turned up high in some creatures and barely flickering in others. An octopus, thinking across 8 semi-independent arms, is probably having an experience so alien that human language doesn't have the right shape for it. But different is not the same as absent, and that distinction carries weight because if animals genuinely experience their lives, then how they're treated stops being a footnote and becomes a real ethical question. Factory farming, animal testing, the quiet destruction of habitats, all of it was easier to justify under the old assumption that nothing was really home behind those eyes. The science increasingly says otherwise. That doesn't collapse every animal into moral equivalence with a human, and the details of what follows from it are genuinely complicated. But it does mean the suffering is real, not scenery. So, does an animal know it's alive? If you mean something specific, like lying awake at 2 a.m. turning over the concept of mortality, then probably not. That flavor of self-reflective dread does seem to be a mostly human specialty, and given what it costs us in sleep and therapy bills, it's not obviously a prize worth wanting. But if you mean something simpler, is there a felt first-person something to being them? Then for a striking number of animals, the honest answer leans toward yes. Not certainty, never certainty, but something. Go back to that creature sprawled in the sunlight on your floor. It doesn't know what a mortgage is. It has no opinion about geopolitics. It will never write an essay about its own mortality. But when you walk through the door, something happens inside it that functions. From the inside, like joy. When it curls up beside you, something that functions like comfort. When it's unwell, something that functions like misery. It lives entirely inside the present moment, with no dread of tomorrow weighing it down, which, when you sit with it, sounds less like a limitation and more like a small kind of mercy. The question was never really about animals. It was about what knowing even means, and how wide the circle of felt experience actually stretches once you stop assuming it starts and stops with you. A bee rolling a wooden ball for no reason but pleasure. An elephant standing at a spot where it lost someone. A fish reacting to its own reflection. A creature on your floor, legs twitching mid-dream, chasing something only it can see. All of them, in their own separate ways, present. All of them in some form we can sense but never fully enter. Alive. That's usually where the good questions leave you.